All right, so today we're going to be talking about React component lifecycles. So this is a fundamental topic of React that's kind of important to understand for having applications that do what you want it to do and do it correctly. So to get started, let's actually talk about the human lifecycle. So hopefully most of us or all of us are familiar with the human lifecycle. We have conception. So that's a biology 101 topic, or you guys can take Platoon's biology bootcamp. That'll be offered at some point. But yeah, conception is the first thing that happens for life. After that, we have a stage called birth. So in this case, you might say hello world. Aging, every year we celebrate or at least have a birthday. And then eventually, unfortunately, we all will encounter death. And it's part of our human life cycle, right? So these are the four points that I want to kind of point out: conception, birth, aging, and death. Why are we talking about human life cycle? Well, because I think it's kind of easy to kind of parallel it with the React component life cycle. So if we talk about the React component life cycle, we have some similar, I guess, points in the life of a component. So first, we have something called conception, and this is where the component is being created by a parent component. All right, so the parent component says, hey, I want to render a meal component, for example, which we did in our previous example. That's the point of conception. All right, birth is actually when the component is actually rendered to your screen. So we talked about the DOM before. This is where like the elements or whatever elements you're adding to the DOM are actually added and shown to the output. So birth, again, is when you actually make that first render and that your output is updated on your user's end. Aging is the idea of a component updating through various means. Usually it's through user input. So like again, user inputs breakfast or the breakfast item, when they hit submit, something's going to happen with your component. Your component is still alive. It's not a brand new component. It's the very same component, just has a different internal data or different rendering that it's showing. So components will update. It's not the same as aging because we grow older. Components don't have to change. They could stay constant for their entire lifetime. All right, so that's the idea of aging in this parallel, I guess. It's just the idea that components can update throughout their life. They're not forced to kind of just stay static throughout their lifetime. And then ultimately, much like humans, components will go through a death. So the idea of a death for a component is basically it's being taken away from the DOM. So if we're showing like two components conditionally, let's say we want to show like an input component and then like output component conditionally. Well, when we remove one from the DOM, that's like the death of that component. The component actually goes away. It's not kind of stored somewhere else. It just kind of gets wiped out from React's world, and then you have to create a new one if you need to show it again.
So it's like scope?
Yeah, it's like a variable in scope. Yeah, if a variable goes out of scope, the variable is kind of lost. Your application does not remember every variable you created if it doesn't need to. So yeah, if a variable goes out of scope, in the same way, if a component kind of goes out of scope, it just goes away and it's kind of deleted from memory.
That's if it applies to the condition or not, right? Like, and then it just deletes, it just gets removed.
Correct. If it's not actually rendered to the screen, it's going to be removed. So it's not part of your render method. So I don't know if I still have my code up. If we go to my meal.js, make this a little larger. So we wrote this for our previous review. Here we have, these aren't necessarily components, but they're still effectively the same thing. In this case, we're either showing a paragraph tag or a div with some other items in it. If we don't render this part of our render, this just doesn't exist, right? So this could easily be a component if you guys can visually or imaginarily kind of think of this. Like, let's make this an inputs components. All right, so here I might have another component that I'm rendering, and that's going to have the logic I just copied. So imagine that my input component is just that div that I copied away. So now if this is not, like this part of my ternary is not operated, this input component never exists. If it exists initially, let's say, this.state.meal was null initially, which it is because we have an input, this would be rendered to the screen. But the moment we get back to this render and we say, okay, show this paragraph, well, the input component no longer needs to be rendered, so it's basically kicked out and it's gone. All right, let me undo my changes quickly. All right. So again, that's the React lifecycle. Hopefully those concepts are familiar, just kind of taking it from the human lifecycle, more or less kind of applies to React component lifecycles. We have conception where a component is created, but not yet put onto the DOM. So it's not actually shown. When it gets, when it goes through its birth, that's when it's first added to the DOM. So that's when your user will first see your component at birth. They won't see it at conception. All right, and then aging, not the best parallel, but yeah, components can change and update as they live. And then when they get pulled off the DOM, they go through a death. All right, so let's talk about this in a more specific coding manner. So these are component lifecycle methods that you're gonna wanna know. This is for, I wanna make this clear, this is for class-based components. So we're gonna be talking about class-based components for like 80% of this lecture, and we're gonna switch over to function-based component at the very end. Again, both class-based components, function-based components, they're doing the same thing. They're just rendering a component with some logic in it. So don't get caught up in like, oh, I need to know both. Just kind of understand the concepts, and then you should be able to look up how to achieve what you want once you understand the concepts. So we talk about the lifecycle methods. Let's talk about the actual functions that are involved here. So upon conception, the constructor of your class-based component is going to get called. So let's actually try coding something up. I don't know if I want to use this example. Fine, we'll use this meal example. So I'm going to have a constructor. This will take in props. And let me try to think if I should continue this example. I'm not going to continue this example because I don't want to confuse anyone. So let's start from scratch here. Let's.
What were the four again?
Pardon? Oh,
What were the four functions?
I'll bring back the slides. Just want to start from scratch here. So I'm going to use the same project, so I don't have to install React again. All right, so we have a class-based component here. Nothing magical going on. We don't have the meal. That went away. All right, so the four methods or the 4 points, you have a constructor. So your class can have a constructor method. And that's something we're going to create here. So I'm going to create a constructor, and then we'll talk about why we might want it. So let's just create a constructor. I'm going to take in props. So don't forget to add props, because that is a mandatory parameter there. And then you want to call your base class, so super props. Again, you have to call super because your component, you're extending a component class object that requires props to exist. So you need to pass down those props so that component knows about it. Otherwise, this constructor is just not going to deal with anything that component needs. So if you call super props, we're going to take in some props and pass it down to our base class. All right, so this is our, let's say, birth. When we create our app component, so if we go to index.js, when this is being created for the first time, it's going to call your constructor. This is automatically going to be called by JavaScript. All right, so let's do a console.log and say, I'm being born. Okay, and this is in the constructor. So let's make that clear, constructor. Okay, so when this is getting created, we should get a console log value of constructor I'm being born. Okay, next we have post birth. So after your component gets added to the DOM or rendered to the screen, a method called component did mount will automatically be called by React. So that, again, it is vital that you use the exact naming shown here. These are methods that React is going to look for and call. So you don't have the freedom to kind of name these whatever you want. They must be named constructor, component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount. All right, and this is where documentation comes back into the flow, because again, you might not memorize this, but you should be able to read documentation and understand what these methods are doing, or what these methods are doing. So again, post birth, this is after your component has been added to the DOM. A method called component did mount will be called by React, and you could do anything you want to do in that method after the first render. Likewise, after any update, there's a method called component did update that's going to be called. So you could react to any update. So if we like update a state value, the component re-renders. If you want to do anything else after that, we can do that in component did update. And then finally, before death. So unfortunately for humans, we don't really know when we're going to die. That'd be kind of cool if we did, or kind of scary also. But for React components, they know right before they're going to die, they're going to call some method called component will unmount. So in this method, you should clean up anything you were doing before. We're going to talk more about these specifically, but just kind of understand at what point in the life cycle these methods are called. All right, so there's this fancy diagram, hopefully not too fancy. I found this on the web. This is part of the React documentation, but this kind of shows you the life of a component. So there's three stages. There's mounting, which is you can think of as creation, updating, which you can think of as aging, and then unmounting is death, or when it's going to be removed from the DOM. So mounting is when we're adding it first to the DOM, as in showing it for the first time. It goes through this process. It calls your constructor, so that's when the component's being created. It's going to do an initial render, and then it's going to call a component did mount down here. All right, so this is the mounting case. It goes through these three methods. For updating, updating can be triggered by there's three means that will automatically update. Sorry, not automatic, or three means that will trigger a re-render of your component. One is if your prop values change. So if we remember our meal example, if we added a new meal name for our prop, that will trigger a re-render of that component, if that ever changed. Also, we talked about state values. If an internal state value changes, that's going to automatically trigger a re-render. So this is, again, updating a component. Props can trigger a re-render from a parent. So if a parent changes its props to its child, that's going to re-render the child. If you internally set a state value inside of a component, that's going to re-render the component. And finally, there's a method to manually do it. So let's say for whatever reason, you want to force a re-render. There's a method called force update that will also trigger re-render. I was right. I've never really used force update, but again, that's just like the hard-coded way to say, hey, just re-render for me. I know state didn't change or props didn't change, but I want you to re-render. Again, I haven't come across use cases where I need to use it, but there might be a use case that you might run into. Anyway, after any of those updates happening, a method called component did updates, as we talked about, will get called. So after any updating render, component did update will kind of handle any logic you need to do. And then finally, unmounting is basically when something's going to be taken off the DOM. React will automatically call component will unmount for your component, and you could do anything you want to do before it gets removed. All right, so this is a simplified version of the lifecycle. If we actually go to the diagram here, so you could search for, what is it? React components lifecycle diagram should be the first result. If you type it correctly, should be the first result. So I click component lifecycle. There's that. Sorry, I want to get to the diagram. So I think it's the second result for that search. All right, you should get to this page. It's at projects.woj.techmoj.pl. Again, I don't know who created this, but this is referenced from the official documentation, so you can trust it. But let's take a look here. So this is basically what I showed you in that slide over here, right? Same image, just different color, I guess. I don't know how to make it darker. But these are, again, this is a simplified view. If you click this check button up here that says show less common lifecycle methods, well, the picture gets a little more advanced. So there's a few more methods that kind of sneak in. These exist. It's just they're not vital, or they're not going to be important to understand for the most part. So there's a method called get derived state from props, should component update, and some other methods that could be useful for your development. So just kind of understand there are other methods part of the lifecycle, but we're going to be just focusing on the bottom three because those are the most important. Component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount.
This is almost like Git with the add and then commit, push it.
Git
Sort of.
add. Could you explain that?
I was just looking on the left side of kind of like where the render is almost like the Git add, and then the pre-commit is kind of like you commit to your Git, and commit phase is like pushing it back up.
Gotcha. Yeah, maybe. I mean, yeah, if that helps you kind of understand it. I'm not sure if I see the connection, but yeah, kind of just understand the flow here. So mounting, updating, and unmounting three, I guess, stages for your component.
So it says that render can be paused, aborted, or restarted.
Pardon, could you ask that question again, Sarah?
It says on the left that render can be paused, aborted, or restarted.
Yes. So as I mentioned, anytime your props or your state values change, it's going to lead to a render, but you can circumvent that with these methods. So there's a method called should component update. And the cool thing about this diagram, if you click on the method, it'll take you to the doc page. So should component update. This is a method that could prevent the render from happening. So let's say a state value changed, and you know as a developer that your component does not need to render based on that particular state value changing. You can say, hey, you know, my breakfast meal changed, but I actually don't want to re-render anything to the screen. So you could block, abort that re-render in should component update. Okay, but let's actually talk about these methods more in detail, and we'll get to some of these less common ones also. So I'm going to uncheck that. Let's kind of stare at that. So get familiar with this idea. Maybe try to, you know, take a mental snapshot of this this image, but you can always reference it anytime you need to come back to it. All right, so we're going to talk about mounting first. So 3 buckets here. Mounting is the most complicated. Updating is also complicated. Unmounting is fairly straightforward. So that one should be the easiest to talk about. But first, let's talk about mounting. Where did my slides go? Sorry, technical difficulties here. There we go. I seem to have lost my slides, so let me get them back. Sorry, I will be back in 1 second while I find my slides. Not sure if Google had to freak out. Lectures, presentations, and we're talking about React lifecycle. All right, let's try this again. Yeah, I think my slides just like died. It's part of the slide lifecycle also. Let's put that here. Oh, sorry.
I did to mount itself.
Okay. Sorry, it's going. All right, okay, we're talking about mounting here. All right, so Lion King, great movie. If you've not seen it, then I'm not sure what you did in the 90s, but maybe you weren't born in the 90s. But anyway, mounting, the idea of just, you know, when we get born and then get added to the world. So in that case, for a React component lifecycle, it's when it gets added to the DOM. So let's talk about mounting. So these are the methods that are involved with mounting. First is a constructor. So we talked about constructor. It takes in props. So any prop values that your parent component is passing to you, it's going to be captured in the constructor via a props value. Again, if you do not create a constructor yourself, there'll be a default constructor created. So if we talk about a default constructor, this is what your default constructor will look like minus this console log. So if you do not create a constructor, automatically this is going to be done for you. All right? Nothing special going on here. We're just capturing props and passing it down to our base component. So you do not have to create a constructor for all of your class components. You can create it, and there are some times where you need to create it, but you do not have to. All right, so that's your constructor. Then we have something called get derived state from props. We're not going to talk about this too much. This is a static method. So just to review what a static method is, it's going to be a method that's used for all your instances versus your constructor, render, and component did mount. Those are instance methods. They're going to be particular for each instance that you have. Get derived state from props is a static method. So that logic is shared between all of your components. All right, we're not going to talk about that too much, but render we've talked about, we've used it before. Render is where you put the logic of what you actually want shown on your screen. So that's render, we're familiar with that. And the new one we're going to talk about is component did mount. So this is the order we go in for mounting: construct something, render something, and then component did mount. All right, so let's talk about the constructor more in detail. This is the place where you usually want to initialize your state values. You also want to bind your event handlers. This is a little more complicated topic, but something we've ran into before. And then The very important thing here is that it should not cause side effects. What do I mean by side effects? Is that you should not force any other changes for your React component. All right, so here we can initialize some state values. So let's do state. Not sure we're going to store here. So let's say, let's go with breakfast again. And we'll have some default value we're going to store here. So let's say cereal, or maybe make that an empty string. We'll fill that in later. So I'm initializing my state value here. Important thing, you do not want to cause side effects. You never want to call this dot set state and then do something like this. Right? So you don't want to call set state in here. That's known as a side effect. You can just initialize your state values without worrying about, doing this. Right? So don't cause side effects, which is an important concept for constructors that can be done elsewhere. So let's say we create our state value, initialize it here. Again, you can initialize your state value up above. So if I want to create something here like day of week, I can do that also. Let's say we want to hard code a Monday in there. We could hard code a Monday. So this is where we talk about, I don't want to call set state here. So if I'm doing this in two different places, it's not going to work. So I'm going to overwrite my state with my constructor. So the day of the week won't exist. So in this case, I need to move day of the week in here. If this value, for example, is coming from props. So let's say props dot breakfast. All right, so this is a case where my state value depends on some prop value. So whenever I create this component, I'm going to provide it a breakfast prop, and that's what I'm going to initialize to my breakfast state. So actually, this is a bad example, so let me make this a string. This is my breakfast. So usually you don't need to copy over state values, or you don't need to copy over prop values into states, because you could just use the props directly. But let's say my props wanted to somehow create a new state value for me, I could do it this way. All right, so in this case, since my state value depends on some props, I have to move day of the week down here. So now I could still hard code some values, but also have some values that are dependent on the props. Okay, so state values can be initialized in your constructor. They don't have to be, but if they require you to use props, you can do that in here. Okay, we also talk about binding. So this is the idea where we talk about using fat arrow functions, and if you don't, you run into trouble. So let's actually see that in play quickly. Let's create a method here. How do I do this? Let's do handle click. And for now, I'm going to make this a method like normal. And the job of this will be to show an alert. So let's say button was clicked. All right, I'm going to create a button in my render. That's going to call that handler button. Click me. And then on click, we're going to call handle pick. Actually, let's show our day of the week. So let's do this dot state dot day of the week. Today is should work. Let's do it this way. All right, so we're just going to show the day of the week when they click the button. All right, let's actually try to do this and see what happens. So I'm going to save this. Let's bring up a code. For my server. npm start. Should get my server running here. Okay, I got an error, line 9, state's not defined. This dot state. Okay, so we got today is Monday. Because we had, okay, Can someone tell me when I refresh this page, why do I get this is Monday? Anyone happen to know?
Because it's not an anonymous function.
Nope. Good guess, but that's not the cause.
On line 24, on click, you should edit something. No,
Yep.
not just directly call. Yeah.
Yep. So I think Tyler was pointing to this. You should not have parentheses here because that's going to call your function right away. So when this render happens, it's actually going to call my function right here. That's not what I want, right? So just remember, you don't want parentheses added to your handler or on click. You only want that fired when they actually click. So if I save this, and now if I refresh my page, so I refresh my page, notice I don't get that pop-up. I just get a click me button. All right, let me add some new lines here. So break line, break line. So now we have a click me button. So when I click it, let's see what happens. Notice we got cannot read property state of undefined. So question is, why is that happening?
Can we look at the code?
All right, so the question is, why is that happening? I'm basically, my goal here is to have this handle click be called, which is this function right here. And all that should do is pop up an alert box saying today is whatever day of the week we're going with. All right, so the answer is because we are not using an anonymous function, we need to manually bind this function to the this keyword. Now this, again, is a lot of rambling for me. Well, all that means is that this keyword here is not what we think it is. It's not actually referring to this class when this method gets called. This is just a peculiarity of JavaScript. Again, it gets a little complicated, so I'm not going to focus too much on it. But the idea here is whoever is calling my handle click, that is what this is referring to. So my class instance is not actually calling my method here. Whatever this parameter here, it's something else. I don't know quite how to explain it, but handle click, this value is not your instance in this case. The reason is because you didn't bind your method to the class. So if you want to bind it, you need to you could add this to your constructor. So to do this, again, just kind of take the syntax, and if you never want to use it, that's fine. You could just use anonymous methods, but you want to bind this keyword. So if I do this dot handle click, then I want to call this dot handle click dot bind with this. All right, so this looks really weird. What all this is saying is this that exists in my constructor, which is the class instance, bind that to handle click. So if I do it this way, in my constructor, you need to handle your bindings. So if I save this and then go here, I should get, hey, today is Monday. So again, I know
Are all of those the same this?
yes, in this line of code, this is the same. Yep, we're using this a lot. It's just kind of how you access instance attributes for your class. So we're calling a bind method on your handler and saying bind this, and then that's going to be set equal to our function again. So we have our function created. It's basically going to copy back a function with this keyword bounded to it. So anytime that this function is called, doesn't matter who calls it, this keyword, the keyword of this will be the value that was set here. So in your constructor, this keyword is going to refer to your app instance. But when your handle click is called, that might be called by something else. So in that case, you're saying, hey, I want this keyword to reference my instance, not anything else that called this.
So only whenever you're creating your constructor that you have to bind it.
Yes, you had to bind it if you choose to create methods this way. The way we've mentioned it before, and kind of the easier way and the way I always go about it, is if you don't want to remember having to do this, which I don't want to because it's just kind of complicated, instead of doing this, you can make this an anonymous function. So if I do that arrow function or anonymous function, again, those names are synonymous. If I make this anonymous function, now I can save this, go back to my window, refresh, make sure click me, notice I get the same output. And I did not use this binding. The reason being is when you create an anonymous function in this manner, the this keyword is going to be to the context of your class instead of whatever method or whatever context called your handle clip. So again, I know this is kind of sounding very complicated. Main takeaway here is just create anonymous functions whenever you're calling them from events, and you should be fine. If you do not, just know that your constructor is a place where you want to make these bindings happen. All right, so that's all I want to point out about constructor. That's something you can do for bindings.
Why the heck does it matter whether it's anonymous or not? That doesn't make any sense.
Because we're creating the function here. So at that point, it's just going to capture the context. The context here is the app class. Again, this is a JavaScript topic. I'm not going to focus too much on it. It just kind of to understand anonymous functions work a little differently than functions that you create locally like this. It just is a case. I didn't write JavaScript. I'm not there. I'm sure there's a purpose for it. I can't explain why that exists the way it does. But just know anonymous functions will kind of get you out of that headache of having to manually bind something.
This is reminiscent of what my mother would say, because I said so.
Sure. Yeah. Just do anonymous functions because I said so. Or yeah, there we go. All right. So
Obey Anker.
that's our constructor, right? Initialize states. You can bind event handlers if you want to, or just use anonymous functions. Important thing also, do not cause side effects. Don't force any other changes inside your component. Just initialize the state value, and that's all you should be really doing. All right, that's our constructor. Then we talk about component did mount. So this is where you can initialize the state values that rely on the DOM. So one example I have is like if you want to measure an element size, well, the element needs to exist on your DOM or on the screen for you to actually measure it. So let's say I want to figure out like the width of a component. So let's say I want to figure out the width of my button. To do that, I would do that in component did mount. So if you want to quickly see this as an example, let's create a component did mount. So here I'm going to create components. This will be post birth. We have a method called components did mount. Again, this is a predefined function. You should not kind of create your own and expect it to work the way you want it to. So in this case, component did mount. And then let's do a console log. And we'll say I was rendered to the screen for the first time. And this is in component did mount. Okay, so component did mount will get called after your first initial render to the screen. Okay, so let's actually see this in play. So I'm gonna go back to my page, refresh it, and then let's look at our output. So notice we got two outputs. We got constructor first, which is I'm being born, and then component did mount, I was rendered to the screen the first time. All right. Again, this is the place where you want to initialize any state values that rely on the DOM. Also, this is the place where you want to make initial API calls. So you don't usually want to make API calls in the constructor of your class. That's reading documentation. They weren't really clear on why, but this is the place you want to put your initial API calls, and component did mount. Also, calling set state here will trigger a re-render, which is fine. Know that this will precede the initial screen update. So if we go back to our diagram, if I can find it, constructor gets called, we have an initial render. Then we do a component did mount, which might trigger a re-render. Again, the important thing to remember here is that the DOM will not show the initial render until component did mount. So let's actually see this instead of just talking about it. So let's say I have my click me button. Let's say I want to change the title of that button. So how do I do that? I'm going to do that in component did mount. I'm going to say let's element, so let's let button equal documents.get element ID. And I didn't give my button ID, so let's do that. ID equal show day. I don't know. So we call it show day, which is what I put into here. Assuming we have a button, we want to do something with it. Let's say it button.inner HTML. We'll set that equal to show day. All right, so initially I hard coded click me, and that's going to be run in the first render. But then after my render happens, my component did mount will execute, and we'll change the name on the button to show day. So the question is, are we going to see a flicker? Are we going to see click me initially and then quickly change to show day? So if I save this, refresh. So it's, I don't know how evident it is, but notice there's no flickering. I don't see click me here initially. I can even make this more apparent by maybe making a longer button. Make this super long. Save that. Let's see if this actually flickers. Notice it still says show day, right? The button size wasn't gigantic to start. If I did not have that in there, so let's take this away. So if I had the button initially, notice it's like a longer button. But if you make any changes in component did mount, the changes there will be processed before your first render to the screen. So your user won't see flickering in this manner. So if I refresh, again, my button doesn't flicker in terms of going from a large button to a small button. All right, so that's component did mount. You can call set state here that will trigger a re-render, but will precede the initial screen update. All right, next up, we're going to talk about updating. So we covered this branch where we have a constructor, we have a render, and then we call component did mount. This is where we want to make some API calls. We can do that there initially. So let's actually do that before we get to updating. So let's see if I can find something on the web. Say day of week API. Does this work? All right, maybe I can't find one. All right, we'll bucket that. Let's go to updating then. So updating is the sense where your component can change throughout its lifetime based on user input or whatever else might trigger a change. So let's talk about the methods involved with updating. So here we have a few more methods. We have one called get derived state from props. So that will be called, and you can handle some logic in there. The more interesting one is should component update. This is where you can, again, prevent updating of your component or your rendering of your component if you want to. So should component update will take in two values. It gets the next props and the next state values that are going to be used. So you have a chance to inspect your current props and your new props. So in this case, next props will have that and determine, hey, do I actually want to update something on the screen? If not, you want to avoid doing the render because that's kind of an expensive method. So should component update will return a true or false. And if it returns false, then it's not going to go proceed with the render. If the render did go through though, you're going to get a method called get snapshot before update. Don't worry too much about that. But the important one is component did update, which will also receive some parameters automatically. They'll get previous props, previous state, and something called snapshot, which I've never really used, so we cannot worry about that. All right, so let's talk about these methods a little more in detail. So should component update, again, determine if we actually need to re-render based on props or states changing, return true, which is the default to proceed with a render, or return false if you don't want the render to go through. As I mentioned, it's cheaper to compare values in your application than for React to compare like a new render versus the old render and determine what it needs to actually print out to the screen. So again, if you want to make your application efficient, especially if your rendering is really expensive, make use of this method so that you avoid doing unnecessary renders, and that can speed up your application. The important one here is component did update. So we have previous props, previous state, and then you could respond to changes in the DOM. Also, you can make more API calls as needed based on state and prop changes, and you can conditionally check for changes if calling state. So this last part's really important. If you keep calling set state without actually checking it, that could cause an infinite loop because any set state is going to trigger a re-render. And that's going to basically get you into a loop where you do an update, you get set state got called, you render something, you call component did update, and that's going to call set state again. And so it's going to keep going over and over and over. So you want to make sure that your new state value and your old state values don't match if you want to actually call set state. So as I said, component did update takes in your previous state value. You can use your previous state that's passed in and your current state and determine if those don't match, then you might want to call set state. All right, so let's add component did update to our logic here. So this is going to be post update. We call components did update. And that's going to do some stuff. So let's print out console log. Okay, so let's kind of see this in play. Notice I'm not taking in parameters right now. If I don't care about those parameters, I don't have to pass in, I don't have to capture previous props, previous state, and snapshot. Those are optional to me as a developer. So right now I'm not using them, so I don't have them, but we'll add them in. So if I save this.
That's really good. Change that to component did update.
Okay, thank you. All right, so if I save this, refresh, notice I only get constructor and component did mount, right? I don't get that component update. The reason being is no updates have been triggered after this component was created. All right, even if I click show day, I see the day here, but nothing actually changed within my component. So nothing needed to update. So let's actually change that. So let's trigger an update when we click this button. So if I do that and handle click, let's change some state values. So we have a state value of day of the week. We have breakfast. Let's change this to next day. So I'm going to do this here. Next day. All right, don't want to change the button anymore. All right, so what this button is going to do is change it to the next day of the week. So if I want to do that here, I could do this dot set state, and maybe we need a dictionary. I'm sure there's a better way to do it. Let's look that up quickly. So JavaScript day of the week iterate. Let's see what Stack Overflow has for us. All right, we can do this manually, I guess. I don't know if there's a date time way to do it. Let's create a static dictionary. So we'll do days, week. We'll have an array. Now Monday, just do it the letters. Monday. Then we'll get Tuesday.
Ankur, why are you creating the static array outside of the class?
Good question. So I guess I could create this. Let me create first and I'll answer that question. So Thursday, Friday. Let's just skip weekends. We're gonna have only weekdays here. So I'm creating this here so that it's only created once. I could create it as a static value in here. I just need to look up the syntax for that, but can I do static? I think that should work. So the static keyword, again, that's for class level attributes. Again, if we go back to our Python example, static will say create this only once and it'll be shared by all of my app. If I create multiple app components, it's going to be shared by all of them. So you could create this internally to your class, which I probably should, because I don't want that to be a global variable. But either way, it's going to be data that's kind of shared throughout each instance of my app. If I create this locally like this, well, then every app instance is going to have its own days of the week, which might be fine. But again, that's static data, so it shouldn't be recreated each time. Again, every time we talk about concepts, think about if our data was like gigantic, like millions of records, right? That's going to be a sizable hit if we had to recreate it each time. So we should only really create it once. So here I'll create a static days of the week. I'm going to loop over that in my, let's see. So day of the week will be an integer. Let's call that index. And now when I click that button, I want to update my index. So we'll do set state, and then today. So this is going to be a little trickier, and we'll get to it. So handle click is going to update the day of the week. Question is, can I just do this? Let's see what I want to do here. I want to do app.day of the week and the index. Day of the week. All right, so what's going on here, just to make sure everyone is following along and I'm not going too quickly, I'm keeping track of the day of the, I guess that should be 0, day of the week as an index. I'm going to call my days of the week data structure and get the day out of it. So it's either going to be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. So if I initialize it to 0, I should be able to get a Monday out of here. But if I increment my value like such, I should get to the next index, and I should probably mod this by the size of my data. So I'll do app.days of the week. And .length. Why am I modding this? Can you tell me who do I have on screen?
Ooh, that's a really clever idea. I should use that for programming assignments.
Gotcha. Jeremiah, can you figure out why I'm actually modding this here?
That's so you stay within the days of the week that you have in your build array.
Yep. Good catch there. Yep. Just wanted to quiz you guys quickly. But yeah, the reason I'm modding my index is because I don't want to run out of bounds, right? If I keep adding 1, eventually my index is going to get to like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then it's going to hit 5 and then 6 and then keep going up. But I don't have an index 6 or 5 even. So I don't want to keep incrementing that all the time. I want to make it so that I go back to 0. And the way I go back to 0 is by doing this check. If I get to 5, like if this part equals 5, the +1, I'm going to divide 5 by 5, and the remainder is going to be 0. So I'm going to reset my index back to 0. So that kind of loops between 0 and 4. I can never get to a value of 5 or higher.
Do you need parentheses around that first expression?
Yeah. Most likely do, because I think this has a higher precedence. So good catch. So I was going to cause some trouble. Okay, so days of the week not defined. Day of the week index. What is this? Oh, forgot my this. Easy mistake to make. This dot state dot day of the week. And I need that here too. This dot state dot day of the week index. All right, let's give this a try and see what happens. I'm also going to console. No, I can't do that. All right. So if I click next day, let's kind of walk through this. Initially, my value is set to 0. So my current day is pointing to the Monday. But looking at my next day click, I'm incrementing my next day, and I want to show that value right here. So what do we expect this to be? Jonas, what do you think our printout will be when I hit next day here?
Can you toggle back real quick? I'm sorry, I didn't get a good look at the
So let's make this clear.
should bring up. So it should bring up the day of the week then, right? I'm sorry, I've been trying to follow and I've been successful at it.
Okay, so yeah, just to walk us through what we're trying to do, this button, when we click this button of next day, it's going to call handle click. Handle click is doing 2 things. It's going to increment our day index by 1, and it's going to make sure we're within bounds. So this modulo operator will make sure that we don't go out of bounds with our index. And then it's going to update our day of the week index, which is a state value. So our state value is created here. And then we're going to use that state value to get the day of the week out of our data. All right, so if I do this, I would expect as a developer for this to be Tuesday, But I'm going to tell you it's actually going to be Monday. So I hit next day. Notice I get Monday here. Why do I get Monday?
You haven't made a decision on whether to use the incremented day of the week or the 0.
Correct, but I called set state here, so my day of the week should be incremented, right? I'm updating it here. Right, let's make this simpler. What if I just do day of the week equals 1? So it's always going to be Tuesday now. Shouldn't this show me Tuesday? Let's save that. Go here. Notice I still get Monday. All right.
I have a
So
feeling this has something to do with the life cycle.
sort of. So this I was trying to trick you guys a little bit. If you guys remember, set state is asynchronous. So we talked about this on Friday. We've talked about it before. Set state, this is going to update your day of the week index eventually. It's not going to do it right away. So the problem here is I'm using the old value of day of the week before it actually gets updated by this set state. So if I really want to show this alert, I can't do this in handle click. And you're right, this is where lifecycle methods are going to come into play. So instead of using the day of the week index here, I should do it somewhere else. And this is where, yes, one of our lifecycle methods comes into play. So if I take this away, now my handle click, all it's doing is incrementing the day of the week. It's no longer showing that alert. That alert is going to come from my component did update. So if I put this here, now when my component updates, it's used the updated value of day of the week index. So whenever this set state is processed, again, it's asynchronous. I'm not sure exactly when it's going to get completed, but whenever it does get completed, my day of the week here is going to be the updated value. In this case, it's going to be equal to 1. So I've hard coded a 1 here. So if I save this and now go, let's refresh this page. So if I click next day, boom, I got Tuesday here. Hopefully that's not too small for you guys. I guess my alert doesn't get bigger. Get bigger? Nope. Alert size stays the same. So any questions about that? So this is where
you still have it set to always Tuesday.
Yep, it's always Tuesday. If I want to increment it, I could do that in handle click. So if I bring that back, I had, what is it? This dot state dot day of the week index +1 mod mod it by the app dot days of the week dot length. Okay, so now if I do this, every time I click the next day, it should show me Tuesday, then Wednesday, cool, Thursday, great, Friday, then we're back to Monday. All right, so the important takeaway here is component did update. Look down here. Notice that component did update got called 5 times because I clicked that button 5 times. Well, let's actually maybe show the output of the week. So let me grab this value. It's not that value. Let's say let's day equal, what that is. Again, we have a array, which is days of the week. Just to review, is days of the week. And then we have an index that we're incrementing that's going to grab us a particular day. And then let's console log that day. That log. All right, so same thing, we're just going to print out to our console. So if I refresh and go with this, next day, notice I get Tuesday, component did update, Wednesday. So every time I make an update, component did update gets called. Tuesday, component did update, and so forth. All right, so that's the purpose of component update if you want to react to a change in your state or your props, right? Because again, that happens asynchronously. So when I call set state, I'm not sure when that value updates because it's asynchronous. We talked about asynchronous in depth on Friday. So it's going to happen. I just don't know when. Whenever it does happen, I can react to it. All right, so that's our post update. Component did update. Last one is pre-def. And if you remember the name of our method there was components will unmounts. There you go. And then you could do whatever you need to do here. So let's just do a console log to show what's going on here. Full amounts. I'm about to be removed from the. Okay, so this will trigger whenever your component is about to be taken off the screen. Now, the problem is we have our app component here. When is that actually going to get removed? In this case, it's not. So this is going to be a little hard to see. So I'm going to do some quick refactoring here so we can actually see this in play. So I'm going to create a new component. Let's call it components folder. Always get to get more practice with, oops, sorry, I guess I already have one. Components, there we are. Let's create a new component. Let's call it day.js. In day.js, I'm going to create a class-based component. So let's do class, let's do it quickly, React class component, and call it day. Again, similar syntax. This should not be unfamiliar to you. We import component, extend it, create our class, and have some render method. And then don't forget to export your component. So now I'm going to create day. I'm going to copy over a lot of this logic. So sorry for going through this copy and paste, but probably should have it nested somewhere. So let's have our dictionary, or not dictionary, but our list of days there. Also, all of our constructors and updating can go there. So really, I'm just moving all my logic into this day component. The reason being is because I want to be able to take it off without taking my app off. Not sure why this is not tabbed for me. Okay, so we have our constructor, post birth, and then last thing for our render. What do we have here? All right, so I'm just going to render my day component here and give that to my render. Okay, so hopefully you guys kind of kept up with me. It's moved everything that I had in my app into a lower component. The only thing
Looks
I
like
need.
you need to include it.
Yep. Good catch. So import day from components. All right, so it's moved all that logic into day, and now day is doing the same thing it did before. So if I, so I need to change the name of app to be day and 54. So my parent class changed for that. So I need to update that. All right, we're good to go. That should be the same thing. So nothing changed on our screen. We're showing the same thing. This next button is just nested within our day component. So if I click next, notice we get the same thing. Nothing different from before. The thing I wanted to highlight was when do we actually remove this component? So let's actually create a new button at our app level. Let's say button remove day component. Click. And then we want to remove the component. So let's say let's have a state value. Show day component. That'll be true by default. And let's say toggle day components. And this will be handled by toggle. All right, so I'm creating a handler called toggle day component. That's going to be an anonymous function. Again, we talked about why we prefer anonymous functions, so we don't have to worry about binding. Don't want this here. Okay, so toggle day component, all we'll do is change the state value of this. So if I do this dot set state, and then I want to change this to be the opposite. So I'll take this and flip it. All right, so all I'm doing is taking the opposite value of that Boolean and setting that state. So when I click the toggle button, it should remove this out of my render if I do this properly. So Now I'm going to conditionally show this. If I do this dot state dot show date component, if that's true, I want to show the date component. Also, I'm just going to show components has been unmounted. All right, so in one case, I'll show the component, other case, I'll just show a string saying, hey, component got unmounted. You guys with me? So I go, Steven, you're shaking your head. Where did I lose you? You're muted.
When we started to do the whatchamacallit, the post life cycle or something like that.
Post lifecycle. Okay, so I haven't gone to the post. I guess I did write that. So yeah, so I added pre-death. So let's go through let's just review what we did. So we did birth. This is where we create a component. We have a constructor that handles kind of our birth. Here we initialize some values. In this case, breakfast I'm not using anymore, but if I did pass down a breakfast value, let's actually do that to see it in place. If I did at day, let's pass in a breakfast. I'll just hard code that as cereal. So now we're passing a prop, as we did before, down to day. And so the reason I have my state initialization in my constructor is because my breakfast value depends on my props. So I can't do this up here, right? If I tried to do this here, I would get an error because there's no props available at this point in my class. That only gets introduced in my constructor. So if I try to run this, let's see what happens. I want to print out that value, so let's do a console. Console.log of this.state.breakfast. See if this actually works or not. Okay, I guess that actually works. So I guess I lost myself here. Apparently you can set this, but I'm surprised that you can. Normally you want to set it inside your props. Excuse me for my lack of clarity here. So this did seem to work, but I'm not sure why. Anyway, so we set our state values here, and then we have some console logs. Post-birth, this is after your first render. So after something is rendered to the screen, we'll get component did update, or sorry, did mount. Any update that happens is when something changes in your app. So if we go back to our diagram, I find the diagram to be very helpful. Anytime that your prop value changed or your state values changed. So in our code here, when we click handle click, we're actually changing a state value. In this case, we're changing day of the week. So since this is happening, that's going to trigger a render again. And once that render is complete, we get our post update method that gets called. So in this case, component did update will get called after set state successfully sets the state value. We're going to re-render, and then we're going to have access to that new state value right here. As I mentioned, your post update actually takes in prev props, was it? I always need to double check. So it's pre props, pre state, and then something called snapshot, which I don't care about. But here, if we actually did something like let previous state, that's going to be equal to prev state. Copy this over. So now previous state is going to contain that value. So I did prev state. That should contain my previous state. So if I actually want to show that here, we could do yesterday was previous day. Okay, so again, this just contains your old values in case you want to compare them. And we'll talk about why that becomes important in one moment. So I save this and click next day. Notice we get yesterday was Monday. Cool. Today is Tuesday. All right, so again, this method, component did update, will get fired every time anything in your props change or your states change. So props come in from your parents, state is your internal value. Stephen, do you have any questions about this post updating componented update? Nope. All right, so just know that this method automatically gets called by React anytime your state values change or your props value change. That's what I want you guys to focus on. And then the last one is pre-def. So component will unmount. We've not shown that one yet, so let's do that. So it should print out to the console, component will unmount. I'm about to be removed from the screen. Nothing too exciting. Put a sad face there because it's a sad event. All right, so if I save that, let's refresh and start from scratch. So the first thing is we got constructor. We got component did mount. Let's make an update. So if I make update, I click next day. Notice we got Tuesday. And then component did update. So it's rendered to the screen. Let's do that again. Okay, another update. So we have as many updates as we need to. There's only be one mounting session, but there's going to be multiple updates. Last thing is toggle day component. This should remove the next day button from here, and we should see what we wrote. So if we go back to our code, instead of seeing that at component, we're going to see a string that says component has been unmounted. So if I toggle next day, I was got yesterday was Wednesday. Okay. What happened there? Okay, not expecting. That's not what I expected. But this dot show today. Okay, not sure why that's happening. Button click. Let me try something else. Constructor props and then super props. Let's see if this is what's causing my issue. Move this in here. Let's see if this fixes it. State not defined. This dot state. All right, let's see if this fixes it. So refresh, toggle. Oh, still updating. All right, did updates. All right, so let's review what we're doing. We have a button on click should call toggle day component. Toggle day component should flip that value. And then that should re-render to this. The question is, why is that not re-rendering? Any ideas? Let's print out the value console.log when this is re-rendering. So show day component. And there should be this.state.show day component. See what the value of that is. So refresh. Okay, that's true. Let's see if we hit toggle. Still true. Why is that true? Anyone know?
It's possible with the, we was talking about async earlier, that the value has been changed and it's not rendering in time.
Yeah, I don't think it's an async issue. Let's try changing this to false, hard code that, and see if that fixes it. Okay, so that works. The question is, why was I not toggling it correctly? That's a good question. I actually don't know. So if we hard code set it to false, we get the result I was looking for. So right now we have, we got our constructor component did mount. Let's take away the other noise. So we don't care about our breakfast right now. Go away, and we don't want app to print out anything. Okay, so if we do it this way, refresh, we got our constructor component did mount for the day component. We get updates like before, sure. And then if we hit toggle day, notice we got a component that will unmount. So the component knew it's going to be unmounted. It did whatever it wanted to do, and then we got our alternative, I guess, element here, which is a component head unmounted string. I guess I don't know why I put any quotes. Don't need that. All right, so that's the life cycle for the day component. Again, when we created it, it hits a constructor first, then it calls component did mount after the first render, and then it calls component did update after any updates happen for the state or props. And finally, when it's being unmounted, we call, or React automatically calls your component will unmount method. So that's the last method we haven't talked about. Unmounting will happen to humans and to components alike. Only method we are worried about is component will unmount. So we kind of highlighted that already. And this is where you want to clean up resources. So one example are timers. If you set a timer for your component, let's say if you remember your whack-a-mole challenge where you called set interval. So every second and a half that timer was firing, you want to actually cancel that timer so it doesn't keep running after your component goes away, right? So if your component dies, but that timer was still kind of firing in whatever manages that timer, it's just going to be an unneeded timer that kind of keeps going and going. So component will unmount will be a great place to clean up your timers or any other resources that are no longer needed. Again, you don't want to kind of take up resources if you don't need to. All right, so that covers our lifecycle methods. Before we take a break, any questions on component did mount, did update, or will unmount? Questions, comments?
I'm still
concerns?
gonna digest it for a bit, so I'll probably have some later on that I might take to the channel.
Okay, fair enough. All right, with that, let's take a break, and then we're going to cover functional components, and then make sure we understand again this life cycle. So the best thing that helped me is this diagram, honestly. So stare at this diagram, make sure you understand the flow of things. When components first created, it goes through the mounting process. When it's updating, again, this can happen through any of these 3 items. Usually it's new properties from a parent or a new state value. And then unmounting is just simply when it's being kicked off the DOM. Okay, with that, I'll keep that up here, but let's take a break. So I have, what time is it? It is 11:29. Let's take a 11-minute break. I think we've been going for a long time. And then let's get back at 11:40 and kind of wrap up with functional components.
Can you link that life cycle in chat or somewhere?
Sure. Yep, we'll do. All right, so during the break, I kind of cleaned up my code, got rid of that breakfast value because we weren't using it. And now I'm just printing out components. And I created a method called getDayWithWeek. And I also added some other changes. So let's see what we have here. Okay, That's what that means. Yep. Okay, so I have two buttons now. I have increment day and then show day. So increment day is going to change a value. Show day will actually show it to the screen. I need to call that method. Add an HR. And let's make this a H. All right, so now increment day will just update the value, and then show day will actually increment day. There we go. Okay, show day. I'm not sure what that was for. Force update. Don't want that. Oh yeah. So my goal here. Sorry, I added some stuff during the break. I added two buttons now. I have increment day, which should increment the day counter. Show day is what should actually update the output here. So this is an example of using force update, where show day will actually update the screen. Now, whenever I increment, I don't want the update to go through. So what I'm saying is when I click increment day, I don't want this to update each time. I only want that to update when I hit show day. So the way we do that is one of those methods we talked about before, should component update. So if you want to quickly see an example of this, we should be able to investigate what has changed and then what if we want to react to it. So to do this, I'm going to introduce a new value and call it day. And this will be this.get day of the week. So that's going to be initial value. I looked it up during break again. So just to clarify, you can set your state values inside your constructor or just do it above the constructor. Either way, it works the same. So I think it's personal preference at that point. So just want to get some clarity on that. All right, so we initialize our day value by using this method right here. So this just kind of uses the index and returns the day of the week. How do we actually prevent this from updating each time we call increment day? So we need to figure that out. With that. Coming from line. Oh, okay. All right, so increment day currently still updates it. I don't want that to happen. The way I prevent that is by introducing a new method. Let's do pre-update. Pre-update. I'm going to do should component update. Again, this takes in two parameters. It takes in next props and next state. So I grab those, next props, next state. Now actually I can investigate if I need to change anything. So here I could say, hey, if next states, and what I want to investigate is the day value. So day is going to not be equal, or if that's equal to this dot state dot day, I'm basically going to say don't update. Don't update. The reason I need this is because I have two state values. I have both day of the week index and day that I'm keeping track of. And I only want to update when day is actually changing. I don't care if the index is changing because again, I changed my requirement so I can increment my day behind the scenes and then update day when I need to. So I guess in this case, I maybe shouldn't make day of the week a state value, but just to go with this, I'm gonna keep it a state value so that I could now do this conditionally. So if this hasn't changed, then I don't want to update anything. So if I hit save here, now if I click increment day, notice that nothing changes. But if I hit show day, all right, I got to Wednesday then. And just for example purposes, I kept my increment value. I kept this as a state value. Normally, in this case, if this is not supposed to ever update your output, then you should make this a local variable, or sorry, an instance variable instead of a state value. Well, if I want to do something crazy like or let's say next state equals 4. Sorry, next state dot day of the week index. Say, sorry, I'm trying to walk through my code here. So show day is a button. It's going to call this the day of the week. All right. So I'm dynamically showing my day of the week here. I'm not actually using my state value of day, but the way I've coded it now is that anytime I hit Friday, which is index 4, or if I hit the show day button, I should see my day. So let's walk through this. If I hit increment day, 3 times, it should get to Tuesday, Wednesday, I guess 4 times. Thursday, when we get to Friday, it should update. So I click this. That did not do what I wanted. Oh, sorry. That should be a positive case. So I should do if next state dot day of the week is 4, return true. So this will circumvent this block here. So now whenever I get to Friday, I want my increment to automatically update it. So let's see that. So I'm going to hit this and it's going to say Monday until I get to Friday. So increment, there goes to Friday. So now anytime I get to Friday, that's when I get to update. So again, this prevents some extra rendering based on my use cases. Again, this doesn't make much sense where increment only shows for Friday or show day will automatically show it. But you can kind of do what you want with whatever you're coding up. Okay, so that's just a quick example of should component update. But the main thing I want to focus on now is let's talk about functional components. All right, so we have this magic hook called Usefx that some of you guys have looked into. This Usefx basically is going to handle all 3 of your main lifecycle methods: did mount, component did update, and will unmount. All right, so that's all packaged into one Usefx, and that's why I feel like it's a little more confusing. Rather than having these discrete methods, Usefx will handle it all for you, which some might argue that's better because it's all just packaged into one. I think it's a little more confusing. So let's talk about Usefx. This is the syntax for Usefx. It takes in a function and it takes in a dependency array. So let's actually go about converting our class-based component to use Usefx. So what I'm going to do here is go to my coding window. You can find it. I'm going to create a new component and call it day function. All right, so this is going to be a copy of my class component, but I'm going to create a functional copy of it. So copy everything I have here, move it into my functional component, and now my task here is to convert my class component back to a functional component. All right, so let's get practice with that. I'm going to get rid of that, change this to function of day. Let's call it functional.
I wonder if you could automate the conversion.
I'm sure there's something online that will do it for you, but let's get practice with it anyway. We want to make sure we understand the syntax. So I'm going to create this outside now. This needs to be a function that takes in props. So again, constructor for your class takes in props. For a function, the props are passed into your function. So I'm going to get rid of this. And now we talk about where does this stuff happen. So I'm being born. It's going to be, I guess we get rid of this stuff. So we need state values. So let's create state values. To that, I'm going to do const day of week index and then set day index as my setter. Keep it simple. Named. I'm just going to use our use state hook. So hopefully you guys are familiar with that. So we're at that to 0. So again, we're taking our class-based state value and converting it to functional-based. So we use the use state hook, which we need to import. So I'll do that above. Import use state from React. All right, so we have use state there, and then we also want day. So we'll do day as a state value. Again, we're converting to a function-based component. So set day, this could be Monday. All right, so that takes care of all this stuff in the constructor. Component did mount again. So component did mount, should mount, I guess, logic, component did update, and component will unmount. Those are all going to be packaged into one function, and that's going to be your use effects. So let's say these are our states. We're going to have effects. All right, so how does that work? We need to import use effects first thing. We want to use it, and then we introduce a use effects here. All right, so the parameters for this, again, the first parameter is a function. So I'm going to create an anonymous function. It's usually how you will see it. And the second parameter is a dependency list. This is optional. You don't need to have a dependency list if you don't want to, but it does change your behavior. So let's actually look at recreating component did mount with use effects. How do we do that? So the first thing is component did mount. I want to point to the dependency array. All right, so these two things, use effects with an empty dependency list will simulate component did mount. What this means is this do something function, whatever it is, will be only triggered once. And that'll be effectively, again, if you imagine a class-based component, this do something would be in component did mount. In functional-based components, you're gonna have a use effect and an empty dependency array. And that will only fire do something that one time when your component initially is rendered the first time. All right, you could do additional things with use effects. So you want to do component did update and component did mount, as in both. So this will trigger after the first render, and after any update happens, this will also trigger. The difference here is that dependency array is no longer specified. So anything that updates your component will fire do something the first time and any other update. So this is a combination of component did mount and component did update. Again, the difference here is there's no dependency array. So this one has a dependency array, this one does not, and that adds a component did update. So any update will trigger your use effect. Then we have state-specific updates. So in this case, I specify that whenever my state value changes, I want this to be triggered. So this is kind of checking, hey, where'd my coding want to go? Where I had my should component update. What was that? Right here, where I only want my should component update when my day value changed. Well, I could just put that day value in my dependency array. So now this would be like this dot, or sorry, this would be day. So anytime the day value changes, this use effect will trigger. But if my other value, in this case, index changes, this should not fire.
That looks really useful.
I mean, yeah, use effect again does everything for you, but it just kind of all the life cycles are kind of bundled together. So it's a little more confusing to understand. But yeah, this allows you more granular control. So you can have multiple use effects if you want to. So let me quickly code something up so we could actually see this. So if I go back to day functional, let's add our use effect. Let's say for day, we want to alert the day state value change. All right, so it's just show an alert whenever the day value changes. Or we could do it for the index. So day of week index. All right, so you could have multiple use effects. You could have, as many as you want, so long as they make sense. So in this case, whenever the day changes, we'll click that. Whenever our index changes, we'll trigger an alert for that. So I actually need to change my code so we actually update day. So how does day actually change? Day does not change. We gotta do this. I got it. All right, let's continue changing our code because I need to change all the functional. So component did mount, that got taken away. If we actually want a component did mount, we can do something like a use effect. So let's do use effects I regret deleting what I had before, but let's do a console.log simulating component did mount with an empty array. Right, so this again, this empty dependency says only fire this one time, and that's when component did like the first after first renders. That's effectively what component did mount would do. But the question is, will these fire? And yes, we'll need to handle that. Pre-update, we don't need to do that. Post update. So again, these will fire post updating. So when day has updated, you'll get your alert. Again, we don't know when day is going to update, right? If we call set state, or in this case, we call set day, that's going to happen asynchronously. But whenever that does complete, whenever day is updated, we'll get that alert.
I have a question. The empty list, if you leave that off, is that the same as just passing in an empty list?
Nope. So if you remember the difference between that, so with the empty list, this will only fire one time, and that is after your initial re-render. If you leave off the empty list, it is not the same meaning. So if you leave it off, it's going to be every update is going to fire also. So let's actually see an example of that in both cases. So let me comment these out. And let's continue with changing our code. So post update. Pre-def we'll talk about. So let me comment that out. And then, all right, we got to update our increment day. Should be calling set index, day index with the value you want. All right, so I'm just again still converting back to functional based component. So we're going to call set day index. Again, that's coming from our set state hook. So we created set day index. What else do we want? That seems not good. There we go. Show day. That's going to do a set state also. So we're going to call the set day setter, and there'll be get day of week, which is defined down here. Week. Okay, so we've successfully changed this so that it's a function-based component. We gotta get rid of the render, of course. Let's take a look at our output and see if it's the same or if we screwed something up. Okay, so what do we have here? Refresh. Notice the same output. So functional, obviously because we're using the same. So let's change this to day functional. Let's import that. Import day functional. Okay, so again, as I mentioned on Friday, you usually don't want to mix and match class-based components, as I have an app class-based component here and functional components. It's going to work. It's just bad practice to go back and forth. But for interest of time, I'm going to keep this as a class-based component. But we're rendering day functional now. So let's see if that looks the same. I got some errors, so let's quickly fix that. Day functional, line 44. So my output tells me what the error is, line 44. Get day of the week, not defined. So I need my const. Const. And day line 64. Day functional. Okay, that should take care of events. I got some warnings. Days never used, increment days never used. Oh, because I still have this in here. Okay, so I think that should be good. All right, let's refresh, make sure we're good. All right, so I increment day. That's, oh, still have this in there. Always gets a little tricky there. All right, that should take care of it. Line 40. All right, fingers crossed, that's all we need to do. So if I increment day, that still changes the output. Show day does the same thing. But let's actually look at our output down here. So we got a simulating component did mount. But if I actually added If I take away this dependency, now it's going to do it for any update. So if I save this, now anytime I hit increment day, notice I get simulating component did mount each time. That's because without the dependency array, any update to any state value is going to trigger that update, because we did not limit what's going to trigger. So in this case, we're saying no updates should call this. Only the initial render will call this. Right? So just understand that dependency array does make a difference if you have it or not. If you don't have it, any update will fire your use effect. Also, you can control it by state. So if we want to see that, I commented those out. All right, so anytime the day value changes, and that will change when I click show day, then I should get this alert. Anytime my index changes, I should get that alert. So now I'm controlling it based on whatever changes. So if I click increment, increment day, notice I got index value has changed. If I click it again, I get index value change. If I click show day, I get the day state value has changed. So again, your Usefx can be as granular as you need them to be. And that's what this is showing. It's a component did mount. So notice this gets called the very first time. So if you notice when I refresh my page, let me start that again, refresh. Notice I get two pop-ups right away, the day value and index value. That's probably not what I want, because I only want those pop up when I update, but know that each use effect we called for every first render, regardless of anything actually changed. So I have my state value specified here. Does do something still gets called on component did mount, or when the component did gets rendered, and for any future state updates. Question is, how do you prevent this component did mount from calling your use effect the first time your application renders? That's where it gets a little confusing. So if you want to do it, you can use something called myref, or use ref hook. So this is from documentation, but you create a ref that's going to maintain a value between function calls. So this is a functional component. Each time it's rendering, it's calling your function. You can store the value and basically store some value so that instead of doing it for component did mount, you can check if that value has been set. So in this case, if my ref.current is true, which is the initial value, we're going to set it to false and return. That's going to prevent our component did mount from firing. So I guess this should read component did update. Change that.
Question on that, Ankur. Can you initialize it as like null or undefined to kind of get around that as well?
Yeah, you can initialize your value to whatever you want. Again, the purpose of this ref is so that the first time we get into this use effect, I don't want to do something. So this if statement is actually returning here. It's hard to see here because I'm on one line. Let me code this up. So if I have, let's do let my ref, let's say initializing equals use ref. Right, so this is saying my initialized value is going to be set to true initially. Right, so this use ref, the purpose of using it is because you want to maintain a value between function calls. So if you kind of read documentation, it'll go more into use ref, but it lets you store a value between every time this function is called. So in this case, initialize will be created once, and then I could check the value. So let's say if initialize, then initialize that current. So the current is the actual value. I want to do initialize. Okay, so this is going to work for one of these, but if I want to do it for both, let's say initialize day. Probably not the best way to do it, but it's a way to do it. All right, so this is effectively what I had coded on the slide before. The purpose of this is to avoid printing out the alert for my initial mount. So if I do avoid components did mount. All right, so again, use ref is just going to magically store the value here so that between every function call, the value will be persisted. I'm going to say read documentation. I know that's not a best explanation, but it's not vital to know right now. Not sure why that's gray. Use ref, I need to include that here. So use ref, it's another hook. Again, with functional components, you're going to be using these hooks. Use ref is a lesser used one. Initialize index day index. All right, so now if I have no typos, when I refresh my page, I shouldn't get those pop-ups. Notice I got no pop-ups. That's because what we achieved here was highlighted in green. We avoid the component did mount with this logic. It's not the easiest. Again, not a fan of Usefx for simulating all these methods, but this is the way you simulate a component did update by ignoring the component did mount. So before, it's going to be a combo component did mount, component did update. If you have a state value, to change that, you need to use some special logic to avoid the first time you render your page. So now, again, when I refresh, I don't get those alerts. But if I click this, now I get state index value has changed, index state has changed, index state has changed. I could do show day and the date state has changed. All right, so Usefx is doing, again, all of your lifecycle methods kind of in one. All right, so if you actually want to see this, let's say console.log components did mounts is being handled here, but we're doing nothing. This is component did update. And the last one that we haven't talked about in use state or Usefx is component will unmount. And this one, you need to return a function. So it's the return value. If you, all right, thank you. If you return a function, that is going to be effectively your component will unmount. So in this case, return cleanup here. This cleanup is what your component will unmount will usually have in a class-based component. But in a functional-based component, this is how you structure your component will unmount. Right, so if we want to see that, let's run return function pointer or anonymous function, and this will simply print out console.log components will unmount. All right, so now we have those three main lifecycle methods. Component did mount is going to be called the very first time. Component did update is for any updates, and then component will unmount will still be called for any of your Usefx. So if I run this, all right, get these. Why is that still updated? Not sure. Refresh. Okay, so if I do increments, yep, I get that. Notice I got did update. And then when will I get that unmount? Well, the question is, wait, what's going on? All right, I got a will unmount here. That is not what I wanted. Oh, right. So cleanup for every my state update. So that's in this case, anytime you run this function, this will be triggered. What I wanted to do was, I want this back. And so if I have a return value there, so now this will simulate component what unmount only when my actual component amounts. So let's change that. Okay, so we got a component did update. We do that again. We get a bunch of components to update. When I actually toggle my component, that's when we get the component will unmount. So again, to see that in our slides, Usefx with an empty brackets, and you return a cleanup function. That cleanup function is your logic for component will unmount. The last slide I had here is if you have a specific Usefx for a state value, that cleanup is going to be run for every state update. So if you need to like reset something anytime, like your day value changes, then you return some function that will be your unmount effectively for that state value. All right, so that completes our circle of life. But the key takeaway from Simba here is read the documentation. That's what's going to kind of fill in all these gaps. So if you go back to my favorite diagram here, you can click on any of these methods. So if I want to know what, show component updates doing, I click on that. If I want to click on show did update, I can click on that. It'll take me to docs, and it has a whole write-up on what this is doing, how to use this function, and should guide you along the way. Again, the Usefx stuff gets a little more complicated. You just got to kind of remember the structure of it. So just review it. Empty dependency list, that's your component did mount. No dependency list, that's component did mount plus component did update. The complicated way is if you want to avoid component did mount, you need to add some logic that prevents the initial update. And then finally, you could do a component will unmount with empty dependency list and returning something out of it. So in this case, the do something here will be fired for component did mount, and the return value will be your component will unmount when you have empty brackets. Okay, and that completes React Lifecycle. What questions do you guys have about any of the lifecycle methods? So again, point you to the diagram, because that is kind of the best way I think is to learn it. So understand these three methods, and then understand in function-based components, you got to use the Usefx hook to simulate these methods.
Are we going to be using the class-based or the functional base going forward?
Both. So we're still using class-based components and then asking you guys to convert to function-based components. So you should be comfortable with both. Again, that makes it a little more, more time intensive, but it is important to understand what these life cycles are and how they're handled in class-based components or function-based components. So we'll see an example in news site 4. I think we're going to be doing it with class-based components, but you should be comfortable doing it with function-based components if we ask you to eventually. All right, so with that, I'm going to stop.